So I am Neil, I'm based in Edinburgh, and I've been asked to talk to you just about Lynch syndrome and gynaecology, because it is crucial, and it has been very much neglected in the past, but that has really changed, I feel now. Like, when I first came to this meeting in 2015, I was apologising because how bad things are. It's still not perfect, but a lot has happened, and so hopefully just to share some of that change that's occurred. So this is just the overview. I'll sort of talk the key bits about the associations between endometrial cancer, so womb cancer, and ovarian cancer, and then talk about what the future directions are. Okay, so where did we start? We started with Lynch syndrome purely being about the bowel. All the research was about the bowel, everything was about the bowel, all the big papers about the bowel. The gynecologists hadn't got a Scooby-Doo what this thing was. Women who were getting womb cancers, and had Lynch, the geneticists knew there was a link, the gynecologists had no idea. So there was this real disconnect when we started off, and that's really represented in the literature, where you've got all of these huge big papers from the sort of early 2000s, which is all about colorectal, and there was nothing from the gynecologists at all. What's really interesting is that these two guys, who look like they'll be great on a night out, let's be honest, so you've got Warther and you've got Lynch. They were the people that first described the families with Lynch syndrome. And if you look at their pedigrees, the family trees, there's loads of endometrial cancer in there. The same amount as there is colorectal cancer. But because men are stupid and sexist and horrid, they were just like, well, that's a lady problem, so we don't need to worry about that. What we need to worry about is the bowel, because men have bowels. So that's kind of what happened with the gynecology story within Lynch. And we've been talking about this a lot today, the fact that what we're really struggling with is that we aren't finding people with Lynch syndrome. I mean, in this room, we've got a pretty good hit rate, I would argue. But we're not really finding people with Lynch syndrome out in the population. And where we weren't looking was at women. It's mad. So what we're trying to do, and what is happening definitely now in England, and I will have a rant about Scotland in a minute, but what is happening in England, obviously, is that there is now really good testing in endometrial cancers. We are following through that testing. We are starting to find women with endometrial cancer associated from Lynch syndrome in higher and higher numbers. Now, unfortunately, David's gone, so I want to show him what a real graphic automation looks like. This is how you do it, guys. So, everyone's probably seen this slide back 1,000 times, but it took me 6 hours to make. So you're going to see it again. It's just going to keep coming. So basically, it's just to explain what's going on in our body all the time. And David did a really good job of explaining that you're making DNA all the time in alarming amounts, because you're losing an alarming number of cells as just part of being alive. And what we're trying to do is, if you think about DNA just as a book, and if I was just to copy out a book over and over again, I'm going to make spelling mistakes all the time, because it's monotonous, and I'm going to lose concentration, and I'm going to put the wrong letter where it shouldn't be. And that's what happens in DNA, effectively. And what's amazing about DNA is it's got proofreaders. So it's got people writing the book, and it's got people reading what's been written and going, hold on, that's a spelling error. Let's get that corrected. So this is a spelling error. G&T, I've made this joke 1,000 times, is a great drink, but shouldn't be seen in... There's a CD from all of the awful jokes I've made with this slide. I will be releasing it at the end of the week. So G&T is a great drink. It's not what should happen in your DNA. So what basically happens is that the proteins that you have all heard over and over again, they work in teams. So team 1 comes in, made up of MSH2, MSH6. Proofreading that DNA says there's a spelling error here. It then calls in its mate, another team, so MLH1, PMS2. They come along and go, yeah, you're right, there is a spelling error here. We'll chop out the spelling error. So they get rid of it. And that means that the person writing the book, DNA polymerase, can come along, rewrite it, correct the spelling error, and you get correct DNA. So what happens in Lynch syndrome is this crucial part here. Once you get your second hit and you lose the gene that's working, this system fails. So you've got DNA being made all the time, but no one's proofreading it. So the spelling errors get through. And very, 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 very rarely, one of those spelling errors hits a gene that's crucial for a cell to do what a cell does, and that's kind of where it all goes wrong and how cancers form. So I think it's always crucial to understand that, and it's crucial to understand it as well, because all the tests that we talk about are based on that basic understanding. So if you've got a protein that's missing, it means that we can't see it when we stain for it, which is what IHC is all about. If your system's not working, it means that you get all these spelling errors, which we can pick up on MSI, so this microsatellite instability testing that we talk about. And if you've got a spelling error in your gene, we can see that when we read your DNA by sequencing it. So those are the testing strategies that we use. And those are testing strategies that we can use in gynecology. So they were all developed in colorectal cancer because that was the only thing that men cared about. But then we also worked out we could use it in womb cancer as well. So let's talk about inherited womb cancer. Obviously, you don't want to hear about Cowden syndrome, but Lynch syndrome, but about 5% of womb cancers are inherited. 5%, which is a significant minority. And when you think of that, that means that that was a preventable womb cancer. When you think about that, that was one that never needed to happen. And the other thing that's really mad about that is that that is one, if it's not detected, that family just carries on not knowing that they've got this problem. It's not acceptable. So work started to happen, first of all, led in the United States, where the group at the MD Anderson in Texas were like, okay, we are, led by a very, very, very impressive woman, which I think made a massive difference. Because she was like, these men are idiots and they have completely, we need to do this ourselves, guys. So she took the problem on, Karen Liu, and she said, let's start looking at Lynch syndrome families and see if there's any association, what is going on with the womb cancer signal. And what she basically showed was that the womb cancers come first, generally speaking. So they are the first cancer. So they are the first warning sign that you have Lynch syndrome. And yet gynecologists were completely oblivious to it. We did some work. This is all just sort of funny little things to make academics happy because it's got lines and P numbers and all that stuff. But what you just have to take away from this is that when you look at Lynch syndrome within endometrial cancer, about 3% of people with endometrial cancer have Lynch syndrome. 3%. Again, a really significant minority that you're just missing. And what that basically means is that you could have your womb cancer, no one diagnosed you with Lynch syndrome, and then you go on to have a colorectal cancer, and that was completely avoidable. You didn't need to have that colorectal cancer. We let you down, and we weren't testing. So that was the situation that we sort of faced back in the day. I went over to Manchester to work with Emma Crosby, who is an absolute powerhouse, and one of the things that she was beginning to pick up on was the complete disparity between the care that people, or the research going on within Lynch syndrome and colorectal and gynecology. So we wrote this piece which was meant to be very provocative, basically saying this is sexist, and it was. And that led us on to do a study where we basically confirmed what we've seen before, how many womb cancers are associated with Lynch syndrome, and we found that there was 3%. So we took that information to NICE, and we said, look, NICE, you've done a really good job in 2017. You've started testing you've said test all colorectal cancers for Lynch syndrome. We want you to do the same in endometrial cancer. And actually, to their credit, they looked at the evidence, they took it on board, they said, this is actually bonkers, guys. We should be absolutely doing this. And so they took it on as a national guideline. These are data that you've seen previously presented. It's just to show that the situation, so this was published in 2017, and it was a survey of gynae-oncologists. So these are specialist gynae cancer surgeons regarding Lynch syndrome, and it was pretty depressing. So what you found was that 20% of gynae cancer specialists, this isn't a gynecologist, this is a cancer specialist, had never heard that Lynch syndrome was associated with ovarian cancer. That's terrifying. Also, a lot of them, 20%, so 1 in 5 said, we don't think we should be testing endometrial cancer for Lynch syndrome. This is a waste of our resources. And the idea around surveillance and screening and all of that stuff, the complicated aftercare or pre-care for women with Lynch syndrome was a complete mess. It was just, everyone was doing something different. Some people were doing low, some people were doing none. Nothing that seemed to be evidence-based. It was a complete mess. These data we've already seen, and we've already talked about the Genomic Medical Service Alliance in a lot of detail, but just to highlight that all the stuff that's come in, Lynch syndrome is at the core of that, but this is only in England. So if there's anyone Scottish in the audience, I would like to hear from you because we need to sort Scotland out because it's depressing. The other thing just to be aware of is that we've talked about checkpoint inhibitors, and David talked about these new treatments that are very effective in cancers with mismatch repair deficiency, so that are cancers associated with Lynch syndrome. That also means that they're effective in womb cancers, okay, as well. So a lot of the learning that we get from colorectal cancer comes back to us, and we can apply it in endometrial cancer, which is very exciting. And the reason it works, and David sort of talked about this already, is effectively you make funny proteins. Those funny proteins stimulate the immune system because they look weird, and the immune system goes, that's not right. And the cancers get around it by switching off the immune system. We get around it by switching back on the immune system using a drug. And that drug has now been, again, approved by NICE to be used in mismatch repair deficient endometrial cancers that are either advanced when we diagnose them, so they've spread, or they've come back. And so there's a new line of therapy that is out there for people who've got advanced endometrial cancers and have Lynch. And we do see advanced endometrial cancers in Lynch syndrome. So this treatment's really exciting for us because it's an add-on to the radical surgery that we would need to propose, or potentially an alternative to the radical surgery that we could propose. So that's a good news story out there. So I don't want anyone to get cancer, but there's a second tier of safety now if you do. There's a new treatment that's very effective. Ovarian cancer is kind of the forgotten part of Lynch syndrome and gynecology, but it's still an important part of the story. It's a rarer cancer seen within women with Lynch syndrome, but it's still something that's interesting from a scientist's point of view, and also it's something that we need to be managing as clinicians. So the reason I say it's interesting is that ovarian cancer associated with Lynch syndrome does not behave like ovarian cancer that you see in the population that doesn't have Lynch syndrome. It tends to be a different type. It tends to be endometrioid, don't worry about that too much, but it tends to be not the cancer that you typically see. And it tends to be discovered quite early, and it tends to not spread, which is weird. Yeah, it's a bit of an odd one. It's very different to the cancers that we see in women who don't have Lynch syndrome. They have high-grade serous, they have widespread disease, it's very difficult to control. This tends to be very different. And what this is just how many people are alive. So what you can see is that in Lynch syndrome, most of them are picked up early. If you do get late-stage disease, your survival is, I mean, we didn't have many cases, but your survival seems to be around the same as if you're in the general population. But your survival, if you've got early onset disease, is excellent. It's much better than it would be if you looked at people without Lynch syndrome. And we think that's the case because the immune system, for the reason that we've already talked about, is responding really strongly to these cancers, because you're making all these funny proteins within the cancer. So the immune system can see the ovarian cancer early on, and it's trying to contain and control that ovarian cancer from the very early point, which is not the case in the high-grade serous, which is a cancer that we see in the general population that doesn't have Lynch syndrome. And the other thing that's really important is that we can test ovarian cancers for Lynch syndrome. This isn't being done yet. It's only being done in small subsets, but the testing works. So when we looked at the way that we test ovarian cancers using the same technologies we use for womb cancers, it does pick up the Lynch syndrome cases. And the next question then is how many ovarian cancers are associated with Lynch syndrome? Because that's an important thing. If you took the general population and only 1 in 1,000 cancers was associated with Lynch syndrome, making the argument to the people that pay for the health service that we should be screening ovarian cancers for Lynch syndrome is just a very difficult argument. So we went back to previously published studies. Some of these studies are pretty ropey, if I'm honest, and it just seems like people had a go and managed to get a publication out of it. Some of them are actually very good, and so we focused on the very good ones. And when you do all the clever analysis thing, the take-home is that it's about 1%. So 1% of endometrial cancers are associated with Lynch syndrome if you just take all endometrial cancers. Now, if you take a certain subset of endometrial cancers, which are called endometrioid, it's about 30%, up to.
You just said endometrial there, you meant ovarian.
I meant ovarian, I beg your point, sorry. I meant ovarian, I'm talking about ovarian. So you can actually find little subgroups of ovarian cancer that are very associated with Lynch syndrome. And so the argument really should be that we're testing those for Lynch syndrome to help find the 95% that are missing currently. So that's work that we're going to hopefully take forward. The other thing that's really exciting, and this has only been published this month, on the 21st of this month, was a guideline that's come out managing ovarian cancer, identifying and managing familial risk in ovarian cancer. This guideline obviously has a very heavy lilt towards the BRCA genes, the BRCA genes, for obvious reasons, but Lynch is very much in there, and I was involved in this guideline, and it was really interesting to be part of a nice guideline from conception. It's really boring, like unbelievably boring, and some of the people almost take your soul as they're talking to you. It's incredible. You sit in this room and you're like, this is terrible. But at the end of it, you do get this out of it, so that's good. And what this basically says is that we made this to confuse everybody. You see? It's like a terrible game of snakes and ladders. But what it's basically trying to do, the take-home of this terrible thing, is that it's going to open up testing for people for BRCA, but also for Lynch, if they've got a pedigree, if they've got family history, if they've got risk factors for ovarian cancer. Because what used to happen was you went to go and see your GP and they went, yeah, I know your mum had breast cancer. Yeah, I know your auntie had ovarian cancer. No, I know. I mean, it sounds terrible, but there's no testing we can do. And we need to change that. Now, that's a lot better now. And what this will do is it will mean that people that pay for the testing have to get on with paying for the testing because it's NICE approved. So there's going to be a real change in access to testing, which I think is, again, really important in finding those 95%. Okay, what do we do about people with, people with Lynch syndrome, and about how do we mitigate their cancer risk, their gynecological cancer risk? What we're basically saying is we're drawing on data which is from the data sets that we've already talked about, the prospective Lynch syndrome database, which is run out of Norway, and from key centres in the UK contribute that data. And so it gives us an idea of how to personalise when we recommend to have risk-reducing surgery. What do I mean by risk-reducing surgery? I mean removal of your tubes and ovaries and removal of your womb and cervix. Okay? So if you have MLH1 or MSH2, we think we should be doing this at around about 35 to 40. If you've got MSH6, again, 35 to 40. We'll modify this because obviously people have, they want to have families. There's lots that people have things happening. Like, they have lives. So I'm not going to turn up and at 35, turn up at your front door, ready to do a hysterectomy. That's not going to happen. But this is when we start talking about it and start sort of discussing it and start sort of saying, this is, we need to mitigate this risk. It's a high risk. This is when we're going to start considering the surgery. And if it's right for you, we'll go ahead with it. PMS2 is a bit of a difficult one because, one, we don't have much data on this gene because it's a rarer gene, because we think that the number of cancers it causes is less than the other genes. So there's not as many people that have been captured with this gene. It's probably still out there in lots of numbers. It's just that they weren't coming forward with cancers, so they haven't got onto these databases. So the evidence we have around that gene is lower. We have to always be very careful with this gene. Now, it says here hysterectomy only, and I'm very nervous about that. This is what the guidelines are going to sort of lean towards. I don't think that many gynecologists are just going to do a hysterectomy only. I think if you are at the age of 45 to 50, i.e. at the point of menopause or perimenopause, we're going to take the tubes and the ovaries as well because of the risk. Even though it's extremely low of ovarian cancer, I would definitely be taking the tubes, and I probably would be taking the ovaries. And then with a bit of add-back HRT, actually, the sequelae of menopause is pretty much mitigated. So the knock-on effects from that is there. So even though that's said there, that is the reason that is said is because we've got to, when we make a guideline, we've really got to stick to what the data tells us. And the data isn't strong enough for us to say there's a lot of ovarian cancer in this gene, but that's okay because I think people are still sensible, and you'll find that gynaecologists will go, this is mad. We'll just, look, if you want your ovaries taken as well, we'll do that. Okay, and where does all that come from? It comes from this amazing paper, which is one of those, excuse the French, but it's one of my favourite no-shit Sherlock papers I've ever read. It's incredible. It basically says, if you have a hysterectomy, you won't get womb cancer. Isn't it amazing? And, I literally fell out of my chair when I read this paper. I was like, that is mind-blowing. But it got published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is like the best medical journal in the world. And she literally is like, look, we took out these people's wombs. They didn't get cancer in their womb because their womb is in a bucket. And it was just like, oh my God. Like, if this is what it takes to get a New England Journal of Medicine publication, I'm all over it. Oh, those are just references. I'm not, oh, hold on. I will be done in a sec, so I know I'm nearly there. So surveillance is the thing I wanted to touch upon, and I just wanted to surveillance is a topic in itself that we're not going to be able to cover in great detail. But what there is that there's this paper which is in the general population, so this is not people with high risk, it's everybody, and it says that screening for ovarian cancer does not work, surveillance doesn't work. This is a paper in a higher risk group, so it's women with an inherited predisposition, but very few of those had Lynch syndrome, I'm afraid, like only, what is it? Yeah, like 2% there. So that's a really low number, so we can't really draw conclusions about Lynch syndrome from this paper. And if you look at all the publications about surveillance in Lynch syndrome for endometrial cancer and ovarian cancer, they're all contradictory. It's a real mess. The methodologies are really poor. Everything's a bit of a shit shower, I'm afraid. So we don't have the evidence to sort of say what to do. So I think we have to be pragmatic. Now, this is something I wrote, so it's very good. And it's designed to sort of summarise all of the things around the controversies and the uncertainties within surveillance. So please, if you want to sort of understand that a bit better, have a read of that. It's designed to be read in a way that's straightforward. And it's just to also say that that has carried through into the guidelines. So these are just different guidelines from different international and national bodies across the world. And as you can see, the guidelines around surveillance in gynecology don't match up. They are all different. Everyone's saying to do a different thing, and that means that the evidence isn't there. So it's based on expert opinion. So my attitude is, as long as I'm informing the person in front of me that there is uncertainty and we don't know if screening works and we don't know if surveillance is helpful and we do know there are risks to surveillance, if they still want surveillance, that is fine by me. Like, if that is going to help them, carry on living their lives, I do not mind that. But what I shouldn't be doing is pushing surveillance because I don't know if it works. So that's the way that I would deal with it. I think that's the way that most gynecologists will deal with it. That, it's just sort of saying, look, we don't know, so we can't be confident that this works. But if you find this helpful, that's fine. Be aware of your symptoms. So if you are developing symptoms that are non-specific and feel like IBS or anything like that, you get to go and see your GP straight away. You don't muck about. If the GP fobs you off, see a different one. It's as simple as that. You are in a different risk category. You are not coming in as a member of the general population with the general population risks. If you have symptoms that are concerning you, see your GP. If you are not happy with them, see another one. So this beautiful man, who's now shaved his head, he doesn't come from Middle Earth, despite what he looks like. He is a beautiful human based in Exeter, so kind of Middle Earth. He's taking all of the evidence that's ever been published on surveillance in gynecology and Lynch syndrome and is trying to make sense of it. So he will publish that soon. So watch this space. So that's very exciting. And just to highlight again that the very brand new NICE guidance, again, kind of says we don't know, is kind of the conclusion from that. So, and they did a big evidence synthesis as well. And they said, as far as surveillance goes, in high-risk women, we just don't know. Yeah, they did. I'll tell you why offline. Juicy. So the future. Okay, so the first thing is that this is an area that I'm starting to look at with some real interest, is this idea that you could do what's called a liquid biopsy. So cell-free DNA. So this is little bits of DNA coming away from a tumor or a precancerous lesion, getting into the bloodstream and floating around. And that could potentially one day be, we're nowhere near this yet. Nowhere near, so don't go to your doctors and be like, I saw this funny little man who was a bit camp, and he said I could have a blood test, so I don't know what you're doing. We're not anywhere near it, but this is hopefully the future, and the idea of this is, like this little diagram shows, you've got some DNA that's come from a cancer or a pre-cancer, it gets into your bloodstream, we take a blood test, we find that DNA, and we realise that there's a problem going on. It's a long way off, give me time. This beautiful lady is Professor Emma Crosby in Manchester. We talked about her. This terrifying device is called the Delphi Screener. And what she is showing, and Jean will talk to you a little bit about some of this as well, what she is showing is that this device basically puts water into the vagina and aspirates water back, and it captures cells, and you can use that to look under the microscope to detect endometrial cancer. So this might be, hysteroscopies are not something I'd wish on anyone. Some people are absolutely fine with them, some people, my God. So this would just be something a GP could do. So instead of having to come into the hospital, do all that stuff, again, a long way away, we're not anywhere near this rolling out clinically, but these are the things that people are thinking about. Okay, this is something that I'm trialing, which I... Look at it. Designed by a man. So this is another device that we're using at the moment called the Allele device. It is not as terrifying as it looks. Basically, a small balloon goes into the vagina. I mean, again, it's all just comical, come on. So it's a small balloon that goes to the vagina. We expand the balloon, and what the balloon is made up of is a hydrophilic membrane. What that means is it captures secretions within the vagina, cells within the vagina, everything that is useful to sequence and look at the DNA within the vagina, and then it stores it in a safe compartment. We send it away for sequencing. And the aim of this is that hopefully, again, this is something your GP could do, and it would mean that if you had symptoms, you could get screened very quickly, and that would tell us whether or not there's a high risk of you having a womb cancer or an abnormality or not. So we're just in the feasibility stage at the moment. In Edinburgh, we've just recruited our first 50 people who all said that this device was much better than having a speculum. So we're going to see what we do next. And one of the things I'd like to do is actually start to see if this device would work as a screening tool in Lynch syndrome. This is the thing that a lot of you have signed up to today, which I'm very grateful for. Jean is doing a really similar study. So there's 2 people wanting your wee today. But the idea of this is that when you pee, you basically, again, those cells that we're talking about from the cancer potentially fall into the urine sample, and we can detect those cells. We're not doing that for you today. You're our controls. So you're showing us that whenever someone with Lynch syndrome wheezes, they don't just have microsatellite instability in their urine, because otherwise the test is pointless. And then we're also taking women with cancers that have microsatellite instability to see if we could pick up the cancers in the urine. So again, this could be another way of doing screening. You could just send us some wee. I'll be here, delighted. There's so much urine arriving. But no, on a serious note, this could just be a postal test that you did instead of going into the hospital, like the FIT test that Kevin talked about. Okay, and finally, we've talked about We Need You. You've all signed up, so don't worry about that. There's a joke there that I forgot. My God, I really chuckled on the plane last night when I did this, and I just breezed through it. Okay, and then we've already heard about the vaccine, so I won't go into too much about that, and the vaccine is clever science that I don't understand. So the take-homes are, a lot is changing. Where we still have a lot of uncertainty is around surveillance, and there's lots of things happening with that to try and work out what to do about that, and to get better tests for that. What we do know is having a hysterectomy, removing your tubes, removing your ovaries, reduces your risk dramatically of getting a cancer of the womb or of the tube or of the ovary. And we now know from the big prospective database when we should be recommending that. And we know as well from CAP that aspirin helps with endometrial cancer risk. We know how to mitigate that risk, but that risk involves at the moment having surgery. So it's not ideal. Okay. We're testing endometrial cancers for Lynch syndrome, which is brilliant, and that testing is actually really good. We're not doing that in ovarian cancer. I think that is a missed opportunity, and I think that we need to look at that again. And it is a complete disaster in Scotland what is happening when you compare it to England. So again, if there's anyone Scottish, or if we could try and get that sorted out, that'd be great, because what's happened in England is incredible, all the things you've heard about, and what's happening in Scotland is nothing like that. So we're in a bit of a bad place. Okay, thank you very much. That's my email if you want to ask me anything or send anything, and thank you for your time.